Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us for today's virtual presentation. Today's topic is about clinical trials and cancer care. If you like this video, make sure to give us a thumbs up and or leave us a comment down below. Now without further ado, I'd like to present to you Dr. Maria Garcia-Jimenez.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for this talk on clinical trials and cancer care. My name is Maria Garcia-Jimenez and I'm a hematology oncology fellow at UCLA. The goals for this talk are to answer the following questions. What are clinical trials? Why are clinical trials important? Who can participate in clinical trials? Why should you consider participating in a clinical trial? What are the benefits and risks associated with participating in a clinical trial? What questions should you ask if you are thinking about volunteering for a clinical trial? And where can you go to learn more about clinical trials? So to start off, let's talk about what is a clinical trial. A clinical trial, oftentimes also called a research study, is a study that involves people and involves human beings. Clinical trials help us find new treatments, better understand the causes and genetics of cancer. They help us assess a specific intervention and its effects. They're usually based on a protocol that has been evaluated and approved for participant safety. Clinical trials offer a treatment option to think about at any point in your or your loved one's cancer care. They're usually conducted by a doctor, although oftentimes there are pharmaceutical companies that are involved, and they're voluntary and confidential. To go into a little bit more detail about clinical trials, we will now describe the 4 different phases of clinical trials, which typically represent 4 different options of clinical trials that you might be able to participate in. Phase 1 clinical trials look at safety of a new medication or intervention, and they usually enroll about 1 or 2 dozen participants. Phase 2 clinical trials are usually assessing effectiveness of a new medication or intervention, as well as obtaining information about the safety. And phase 2 clinical trials typically enroll fewer than 100 participants or so. Phase 3 clinical trials are the most common form of clinical trial available, as well as the largest. Phase 3 clinical trials typically enroll in the thousands of patients, and they are typically available at several different medical institutions or hospitals. And they're not only looking at safety and effectiveness, but they're also typically comparing a new medication or intervention with a standard of care, or with nothing if there's no standard of care that is available. And then lastly, phase 4 clinical trials are clinical trials that are usually done on medications that have already been approved by the FDA, and they allow us to collect information about the effect of a new drug or intervention in real patients in real time over many years, a long period of time. It's important to remember that clinical trials of any phase are a treatment option available for all stages of cancer. Why are clinical trials important? Clinical trials contribute to the advancement of medical knowledge about a disease and treatments in different and diverse patient populations. They're an important way of testing medical products in the people that they were meant to help. They provide another option for patients when standard therapy has failed, or when standard therapy is causing patients to have intolerable side effects. And they're basically the only way that we can determine whether or not new treatments are safe, effective, and if they work better than the current treatments available. In terms of who can participate in clinical trials, this varies by clinical trial guidelines that are called eligibility criteria. Eligibility criteria include factors such as age, gender, type and stage of the cancer, previous treatment history of the patients that might enroll, and the presence of other medical conditions or comorbidities. And the reason eligibility criteria exist is because this is the way that we can reduce variation in clinical trials and really see the effects of a medication in the population that they were meant to treat. Because eligibility criteria exists, it means that not everyone who applies for a clinical trial or is interested in a clinical trial will be accepted. So why should you think about participating in a clinical trial, or why should you participate? Participating in a clinical trial allows access to promising new treatments that may directly benefit the participants, i.e. yourself. Clinical trials also give you an opportunity as a patient to contribute to medical knowledge and to partner with doctors and researchers and the medical community in learning more about cancer and helping to improve cancer care for future patients and for yourself. And lastly, clinical trials are really the key to making progress against cancer. As with any medical treatment, participating in a clinical trial comes with benefits and risks. So we will review benefits. One of the benefits of clinical trials, again, is that the participants have access to new treatment that is not available to people outside of the trial. If this new treatment that is being studied is more effective than the standard treatment available, you may be among the first patients to benefit from the therapy. Additionally, participants are protected through the informed consent process, as well as the Institutional Review Board, or IRB, which is a committee that exists that reviews all protocols for clinical trials and makes sure that clinical trials are both ethical and safe for participants. And then lastly, if you participate in a clinical trial, you will have the benefit of having a whole research team that will be watching you closely. Some of the possible risks of participating in a clinical trial include the following. The new treatment that is being tested in the clinical trial may not be better than or even as good as the standard treatment. There may be some side effects that doctors did not expect from the treatment that is being studied in the clinical trial, or there may be side effects that are worse than those with standard treatment. In a clinical trial, you may be required to make more visits to the doctor or have more tests than if you were receiving standard treatment. These additional visits and additional tests may lead to extra expenses related to travel, housing, or childcare. And sometimes health insurance may not cover these additional costs. And then lastly, even if a new treatment has benefit in some patients who are in the clinical trial, it may not work for you. As a doctor myself, in oncology, I've encountered various myths among patients and among the community that I wanted to take a moment to address. This is not an all-inclusive list, but these are some of the most common concerns or thoughts that I have encountered. So the first is that clinical trials are for patients with no other option, meaning that clinical trials are only available to people with very advanced cancers or end-stage disease who don't have any other standard therapies available to them. This is false. Clinical trials, as we had mentioned earlier, exist in different phases, and for all clinical trials, there are options to incorporate them into the treatment of cancer at any stage of the cancer. It can be incorporated in early stage cancer or advanced stage cancer. Another common myth is that once you enroll in a clinical trial, you must stay in it. Again, this is false. Going back to the protections for participants of clinical trials, being in a clinical trial is voluntary. And if at any point you no longer feel that participating in the clinical trial is the right thing for yourself or for your care, you have the right to disenroll. Remember that being in a clinical trial is a partnership with the medical team and the medical community. And so you are never bound to remaining in a clinical trial if that is not what you wish. Another common myth is that when you are in a clinical trial, you are not able to get regular care. This is also false. Even if you are in a clinical trial, you are permitted to and encouraged to continue your regular care meaning visits to your primary care doctor, management of your hypertension or your diabetes, if that applies. It's just important to think about maintaining open lines of communication between the clinical trial doctor and the clinical trial team and your other doctors so that everyone is aware of what's going on with your care. Some people say that if they enroll in clinical trials, they will be a guinea pig. This is false. So important to note is the fact that once a medication or therapy or an intervention makes it to the clinical trial stage, it has been extensively studied in animal models in the laboratory. And so the point of clinical trials is not to test things in human beings without having any safety protocols. And as I mentioned earlier, being in a clinical trial is a partnership. And so you will never be treated as a lab rat if you participate in a clinical trial. And one other common myth is that only a doctor can recommend a clinical trial. This too is false. If at any point you want to discuss a clinical trial with your physician, you are free to do so. And we will talk about some good resources for finding clinical trials on your own in a couple of slides. But just remember that you don't have to wait for your doctor to recommend a clinical trial. It's something that you can ask about at any point in your care. If you are considering participating in a clinical trial, I thought we could talk about some good questions to ask. This is not an all-inclusive list, but these, I think, are good places to start. So some of the things you could ask are, what is being studied? What happens during the trial? Where will the trial be conducted and how often will you have to visit that site? Make sure that you ask to see the protocol. The protocol, again, is a document that contains information about the reasons for conducting the study, who can participate in the study, the number of participants that they hope to enroll, the schedule of tests, procedures, and medications that you would receive if you participate in the clinical trial. It should outline how long the clinical trial will be running for, and it should provide you information about what kind of data will be gathered about the participants. The other thing that you should make sure to ask about is how long do you have to make up your mind about joining a clinical trial? You want to make sure that you ask as many questions as are necessary in order for you to feel comfortable with your decision. You don't want to feel pressured to enroll in a clinical trial, but you also want to be mindful that, as we discussed, many clinical trials have only a limited number of spots available. And so if you truly are interested, you want to make sure that you don't lose a spot. If you're interested in learning more about clinical trials and how they may be incorporated into your cancer care, these are a few places and people to ask about. So you can ask your doctor, you can ask social workers or community organizations that you may be in contact with. If the community organizations or the social workers don't have the direct information about clinical trials, they'll be able to guide you to where you can obtain the information. If you, for example, are a member of a cancer support group or a cancer patient community, you can also talk about clinical trials with other patients. Perhaps there's somebody that you know that has thought about a clinical trial or has participated in a clinical trial, and they would be a good resource for you. And then lastly, of course, you can go online to various websites where you can find more information, both generally about clinical trials, but also about clinical trials that may be relevant to you and your cancer type and stage. So on this slide, the first two websites will allow you to find specific clinical trials that you might want to discuss with your doctor. And the other three links are to websites that provide information in general about clinical trials. So I hope that was a good starting point for information about clinical trials for all of you. If you have any questions or comments, you can feel free to reach me at my email address here. I thank you all for your time. I hope you have a good rest of the day.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you to all for tuning in today. We will be having presentations like this throughout the year, so don't forget to follow us on our social media pages at The Pink Ribbon Place for program updates and for information on future presentations. Thank you so much, and until